Hi, everybody. Welcome to our second of 4 Regional ACE webinars for this academic year. Today's webinar, titled Define Your Story, Define Your Destiny, will be presented by Anthony Juliano. And I'm Ryan Pratt, the Vice President of Marketing and Research at GradLeaders. For those of you who aren't aware, GradLeaders is a relatively new brand that is the result of a merger 3 years ago between MBA Focus and CSO Research. We've been in the business for about 30 years, and over those 30 years, we've partnered with thousands of career centers to help connect their students to their dream jobs. We really think of ourselves as more than career services software and recruitment software providers. We really think of ourselves as partners with schools and employers, and an extension of their office with this shared mutual goal. And we love sharing best practices and creating opportunities for you all to learn from each other. So that's why we're excited about working with the Regional ACEs again this year on this webinar series. A quick reminder before we kick this thing off, everyone has been muted on entry. So if you have questions at any time throughout the webinar, feel free to type them into the chat window within WebEx. And please send your questions to all panelists so that we can all see them. Again, there's a Q&A functionality and a chat functionality, but please use the chat functionality within WebEx if you have questions. And Anthony will get them at the end. We have a Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce one of our panelists, Ailish Wasserman from MWASE.
All right. Thank you. Welcome to the Midwest ACE Regional webinar. We are glad that you are here today. And I am the Director of Professional Development for Midwest ACE. I also work as an Assistant Director Career Coach at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. And I have the privilege and honor of introducing Anthony Juliano, who also works and lives here in Indiana in Fort Wayne. So Anthony Juliano is Vice President and General Manager of Asher Agency and the President of .64 Consulting and Training. An experienced trainer, writer, and marketing and communication strategist, Anthony approaches his work with one simple goal: to help others understand our changing communication environment. Anthony is a seasoned public speaker and trainer on a variety of topics, including communication, marketing, branding, productivity, and social media. He has taught at 4 colleges, has served as a keynote speaker, presented at international conferences, and delivered a TEDx presentation. And we here at Ball State have had the pleasure of working with Anthony. He's also presented recently in the last year at the Career Development Professionals of Indiana Conference. So we're excited to kick off this presentation about Define Your Story, Define Your Destiny. Thank you.
Thanks, Ailish. Thanks, Ryan. And thank you all very much for being part of today's webinar. Well, I want to suggest that today we're offering not just a webinar, we're also going to put you in a time capsule. We're going to take you back 25 years to 1993. Now, many of you might remember this time. If you don't, there's a few things about 1993 that might astonish you. The first is the hairstyles that were in vogue at the time and the fashion choices that people made back in those days. But another thing that might astonish you about 1993 is the fact that it was before the consumer internet. Now, I happen to have graduated college in that year. So for me, the internet was a post-college phenomenon. Now, many of you know the internet had existed since the late 60s, but it was generally for government entities, education, and others, not a consumer phenomenon. And all that changed in the mid-1990s. But in 1993, the internet was not widely known. It was a pretty nuanced thing. Now, why is that relevant to today's conversation? Well, while 25 years ago doesn't seem like a long time ago, it was a different world when it came to personal branding and storytelling. And if you were around in 1993, this will be second nature to you. But if you grew up with the internet and grew up with social media, probably the most amazing thing about the difference between 1993 and today are the options you had for telling your story if you were just an individual in 1993 versus the options today. So let's imagine that you're just a person in human resources or a career development professional or a college student or an individual working for a business, not a business entity itself. If you wanted to get a story out to the world about yourself in 1993, your options were as follows. You could tell your story to people face-to-face. You could call people on the phone and share your story in that way. Or you could use postal mail. You could put something in the mail to people to share your story. 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, 999 times out of 1,000, that was your only option for telling your story. Occasionally, if you had a really compelling story, you might be able to get it into the local media, but that was it. As a result of that, this time, not all that long ago, 25 years ago, one of the main things that defined us, one of the main things that defined our personal brand was the interactions we had with people one-to-one. The interactions we had with people when we were in control of the situation. Well, I want to suggest today that all of this has changed dramatically because today we have so many more options for telling our story that those stories now determine what's available to us, and much of what's available to us is determined before we even have the chance to interact with people face-to-face, one-to-one. Because so much of our destiny is controlled by the stories told about us by others, the stories that people discover about us online. All of the things, all of the impressions that people have about us before they even meet us. And the opportunity for people to either pursue conversations with us based on what they're finding out online and hearing from others, or the possibility that they will decide to not continue the conversation. Now, today I'm going to talk about the way this affects you as career development professionals. I'm going to talk about the way that it affects HR professionals. I'm going to talk about the way it affects the folks you serve, that being college students and your employees. But the bottom line is, in 25 years, we have completely reinvented the opportunities available to people when it comes to telling their story. The problem is, many people are still using old models. Many people are still using the model that they were using in 1993, the models that existed 25 years ago. So what I want to suggest today is that because of this revolution in what's available to us, it's time for a different approach. So I'm going to challenge you today to think very differently about the concept of networking, the concept of personal branding, and the concept of telling a story in a way that's going to allow you and those you serve to reach your goals. Specifically, what I'm going to talk about today looks like this. I'm going to talk about understanding networking. Now, this is one of those things that isn't all that complicated, but it's incredibly important to understand what networking looks like in 2018 versus what it looked like in 1993 or even 2008 for that matter. So we'll talk about how networking has changed and what to do about it. Then we're going to talk about how to develop your story. I've spent a lot of time working with college students, young professionals, business leaders, helping them determine what they should be saying about themselves in order for those messages to stick, in order for those messages to cut through the clutter. And today we're going to talk about some key questions you should be asking yourself and should be asking those you serve in order for them to be able to tell a relevant story. And then finally, we'll talk about the role of social media in enhancing relationships. What you can be doing today, what those you serve can be doing today to leverage social media and all its potential in a way that's going to move you forward. All right, so let's start with the first of these topics, understanding networking. Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir somewhat today, being that you're in career development or you're in HR, you understand full well that our relationships are our greatest asset in our careers, that nothing matters more than the relationships we build. That's what our destinies are determined by, is not what we know, but who we know. Now, I'm going to let you in on a secret. There was a time in my life when I not only didn't believe that who you know is more important than what you know, I also kind of hated that phrase because it seemed to me unfair. At the time, I thought that people should get credit for skills, knowledge, and talent, and who they know should be incidental. Well, like a lot of things in life, as time went on, I found out that the old adage, it's not what you know, it's who you know, just happens to be true. And in fact, while skills, knowledge, and talent absolutely make a difference and are absolutely critical to success, they only matter to the extent that you can connect those things to other people. Now, this is said very well by Tom Peters. We'll hear from him again later in today's session. But Tom Peters says this. He says, the most important personal core competency by far is a rich set of relationships. What he means by that is that all of us will be differentiated more by our relationships than by anything else, by relationships more than incremental differences in skill, knowledge, and talent. So I start with that just so we're on the same page about how important relationships are. But here's the thing. As critical as relationships are, we're not leveraging them to the extent that we could when it comes to networking, because many of us, many of your students, many of those you serve, they're using an old networking model that no longer works. And it's the model that we've passed down generation to generation. The networking model that says what you need to do is you need to craft an elevator pitch in isolation, come up with your story about you, grab a stack of business cards or resumes, go to an event, corner people, shout in their general direction about what you want them to hear, and then move on to the next person. Now, I know that's a little extreme, but that's when you boil it down, the networking model that many of us were taught. I don't know that that ever worked really well, but I am certain in 2018 it doesn't work very well at all. Now, the new model is about mutual benefit. It's about leveraging our ability to be resources to one another. Now, another person we're going to hear about a little bit later this afternoon is Reid Hoffman. Reid Hoffman is the founder of LinkedIn. And when he founded LinkedIn, he said this. He said, the good relationships and alliances you create define your mutual ability to be effective. Now, that's a little bit of a mouthful, especially just after lunch, so let me translate. What Reid Hoffman is saying here is that where professional relationships really matter, where they take off, is when there is mutual benefit, when I can be a resource to you and you can be a resource to me. Now, this has always been somewhat true. It certainly has been true since LinkedIn was launched back in 2003, but it's more true than ever today simply because most people either are extremely busy or they perceive themselves to be extremely busy. What's going to get the attention of your audience today is the things that they believe can be helpful to them, the things that they believe can help them solve problems. If there's any doubt about that, they're going to move on to the next message. So in networking in 2018, the most critical factor is whether people can determine quickly that we can be of benefit to them. If they can't, we're probably not going to get their attention. Now, I say this next thing with all due respect, but my strong belief is that the elevator pitch, the personal elevator pitch, we're not talking about business, but the personal branding elevator pitch is dead. And what we should do with elevator pitches is find the nearest elevator shaft and drop them down it because they no longer work. And instead, we should look at a different model of networking that's built for the current day and for the future. And it's the ability, the imperative, to network with a servant leader's perspective. To network not with a self-interest, but with a spirit of service. Now, I'm sure most of you know what servant leadership is. If not, I'll share a quick definition. This is from the person who coined the term. His name is Robert Greenleaf. He says that servant leaders make sure that other people's highest priority needs are being served. He says the best test, and one that's difficult to administer, is do those served grow as persons? Do they become healthier, wiser, more autonomous, and more likely themselves to become servant leaders? So that's what servant leadership is all about. How is it relevant to networking? Well, it's a pretty simple thing, as I mentioned. It means that when you go to a networking event, when you have the opportunity to meet someone new, when you're in a position to build a relationship, you put the other person's needs first. And the first thing that we should say isn't our elevator pitch. It's nothing about ourselves at all. It is starting every conversation by asking the other person to share their perspective, by seeking to understand how you can help that person. It may be that you can't, and if so, fair enough, and move on. But your first goal in any networking environment in 2018 is to understand how you can be of service to the other person. Now, all of this sounds very well-intentioned. It sounds very selfless, and to some extent it is. But if you're a more pragmatic person, know this. This is also the best way to get what you want. Putting others first is the most certain road to reaching your goals. This was said very well by Zig Ziglar, the late Zig Ziglar, who was a internationally known sales trainer. And he said, you will get all you want in life if you help enough other people get what they want. And that is absolutely true today. It's more true than it's ever been. If you focus on the other person and withhold any comment about yourself until you know that person's perspective, that's going to be the best opportunity to build relationships. Now, if you do this well, if you build relationships in a way that is consistent with servant leadership, you will eventually have the opportunity to share your story. So the next thing I want to talk about is how you do that well. How do you develop a story that cuts through the clutter, that sticks with people, that has meaning, and importantly, that is authentic to what you want the world to know about you? Well, when I talk about your story, a synonym for that is personal branding. And you're all, I'm sure, very familiar with the concept of personal branding. That term was coined by Tom Peters in a 1997 Fast Company article, where he said, everyone has the chance to stand out. Every individual has a chance to be a brand worthy of remark. Now, it's second nature for us today to think about personal branding, but in 1997, this was revolutionary. No one had really said that we as individuals carry with us these personal brands, but it's absolutely true. And to understand how to leverage personal branding in a way that's effective, it's important to first understand what branding is writ large, what it means from a consumer perspective. So let me give you a few definitions of what a brand is. Many of these come from the American Association of Advertising Agencies. The first definition that I'll share is this one. A brand is all the thoughts, feelings, associations, and expectations the prospect or customer experiences. I call this the baggage that people bring to the relationship. It includes what they've seen and heard about a brand in its advertising. It includes what they have heard about the brand from others, and most importantly, it includes their personal experience with the brand. So all those different impressions adding up to a net impression about the brand. Another definition I really like is that a brand is your reputation. It's what a business is known for or known as. Another one I like is that a brand is a promise. It's what people should expect from that organization, that company, based on what they've heard from others, what they've experienced themselves, and what that brand has said about itself. And then finally, it's important to note that a brand is a perception. It's not fixed in time. The perception can be different from person to person. What one people believes about a brand may be different than what the next person thinks about a brand. All right. So that's what branding is from a consumer perspective. Now, I want to give you an example to bring this to life of a brand that really gets it, really does it well, that is world famous for getting branding right. And it's a brand you're probably very familiar with. That brand is Disney. Now, what Disney ultimately is trying to convey is a consistent message in its theme parks, in its retail stores, in the movies that it makes, all coming back to this one idea, this one promise this one net impression that they're trying to reinforce at every touch point. Now, it's important to note because it's a perception, not everyone believes this to be true about Disney, but Disney is good enough at it that a critical mass of people buy into Disney's brand promise. Now, Disney is so good at this that their brand promise can be summed up in one word. One word. And it's a word that begins with the letter M. It's not the word mouse, but Disney's brand promise is magic. That's what they seek to reinforce at every touch point. Let me give you an example of how good Disney is at this. They know that if you go to one of their theme parks, you're probably going to have a pretty great day. However, they also know that there are things that may happen beyond their control that might make that great day a little bit less great. For example, if you drive to one of their theme parks, you have a great day while you're inside. If you come back out and you have a flat tire or a dead battery, all of a sudden that great day isn't so great. So Disney has people in golf carts going around parking lots at its theme parks looking for people with dead batteries, flat tires, etc. And in these golf carts, they have fix-a-flat and they have jumper cables so they can swoop in like magic and take what was a great day that's becoming a bad day into an even better day, and an opportunity for Disney to save the day like magic and turn this into a net positive for the brand. That's how good they are at it. Now, there are thousands of examples I could have used. There are thousands of brands that get it right. But even more than that, there are brands that get it wrong. But here's the thing. Even the brands that get it wrong, even the brands that dismiss branding and say it's not important, even the brands who don't spend a minute on this stuff, they still have a story. Think of the companies that frustrate you. Think of the places where you have bad consumer experiences. They still have a story, right? It's still a brand, even if they don't spend a minute on it. Well, the same is absolutely true of people. And this is a critical message for those of you who work with young people, college students, younger employees if you're in HR. There's a lot of individuals who dismiss personal branding, and they think, it's for other people, it's for celebrities. But absolutely, one of the critical messages that I try to share with college students and young professionals is that they're going to have a story even if they don't intend to. The world is going to create a story for them. The better option is for them to have some say, to take ownership of it, and to tell a story that's aligned with their goals. Because if not, it's very unlikely that the story the world is going to come up with for them is going to help them move towards their goals. Now, with that in mind, when it comes to building a personal brand, when it comes to telling a story, if you are going to be intentional about it, I want to suggest that there's 3 questions that we should ask to begin developing your story. And again, this is something that I've worked on with college students, with young professionals, with CEOs, in the essence of trying to get to the answer that people want to hear when they ask you, what do you do? Or tell me about yourself. Because when people ask that question, they don't want to know your job title. They don't want to even know your company name in most cases. They want to know some very distinct things that you can reinforce by being intentional in telling your story. So here's the first question. First question to ask is, what's your goal? Now you may ask yourself, okay, what does that have to do with the audience? Well, this is about intent. This is about making sure that the story you're telling is aligned with a goal. And many of the people who don't have a great personal story, or who don't have a sense of urgency about creating a great personal story, don't know why they would. They don't have a goal. So I encourage you to have a goal, because it's going to make you much more intentional about presenting yourself in a certain way. It's going to make you much more intentional about knowing what you should be saying, so it's more likely that you hit that target. And I share this because there's a lot of college students, there's a lot of young professionals who are sort of waiting for inspiration to tell them what their goal should be. and what their brand should be. But it doesn't happen that way. It really is a matter of taking ownership of it and first deciding what is it that you want. And having been in the working world now for about 25 years, I know for sure that some of the most unfulfilled people I've ever met in their 40s, 50s, and 60s are people who don't know the answer to this question. But once you know the answer to this question, once you know what it is you want, whether that's material, something material, or if it's a place you want to be, if it is a position you want to have, it is a brand you want to build, that it's impossible to be fulfilled if you don't first know what that is. And when you do know what that is, everything else becomes remarkably easy. Now, the second question that I'd encourage you to think about is this. What is it that you want to be known for? When people think of you, what qualities, what attributes, what skills, what talent, what knowledge do you want to be known for having? What do you want to be known as? When you're not in the room and people describe you, what do you want them to say? Now, I don't suggest that you should think about this because you can force anyone to say anything. You can't. But certainly, if you know what it is you want to be known for, you can put out in the world evidence that reinforces those touch points. If you want to be known as someone who is authentic, well, yes, there are ways to convey that, and there are ways to not convey that. So knowing what it is you want people to say when you're not in the room, knowing what stories you want people to tell about you is critical so that you can start reinforcing those attributes. And remember, I'll reinforce here that a lot of what's available to us, a lot of the opportunities available to us in 2018 are going to be dictated by what's said about us when we're not in the room. So we should focus on making sure we're reinforcing the right qualities. And here's the final question. And I'm being sneaky here because it's actually two questions in one, but it's all about the intersection of these two things. What problem do you solve and for whom? What problem do you solve in the world and for what audience? Now, the reason I add for whom is because if you try to be all things to all people today, you're probably going to be not much to anyone. And solving any problem that's a big problem in the world, in the country, often starts right at home. It starts with first solving that problem with your family, or first starting that problem in your school, or first solving that problem in your community, and then building towards something bigger. But if you start too ambitious, it's not going to be as likely to get traction. So you need to be really specific in deciding what problem do you solve in the world and for whom. This is an especially important question for college students to think about because many don't know. Many haven't given it any thought. And the only way someone's going to employ you, the only way someone's going to choose to give you their attention, the only way someone's going to choose to build a relationship with you is if they first understand what problem it is that you solve in the world and whether that's relevant to them or to someone they know. Now, in working with college students, I tell them that it's okay if they can't answer this question right now, but that they absolutely should be thinking about it because the more quickly they think about it, the more quickly it is they can begin to tell that story. And the more quickly it is they can start aligning their story with the answer to those questions. So it all works together. You want to know your goal so that you can start building a story that gets you towards that goal faster. And to build that story, you have to focus on the audience. What is it that you want them to think about you? How do you reinforce that? What is it that you want them to know about the problem you solve in the world and for whom you want to reinforce that? I can guarantee you if you spend a little bit of time answering those questions, if you work with your students to encourage them to spend a little bit of time answering those questions, that is what their story will become. If they're consistent in telling it, and if they actually back it up in the real world, if they do the things they say they do, if they do the things that reflect those attributes they want to be known for, that will become their story. It will happen incredibly faster if they're intentional about it than if they leave it to chance. If they leave it to chance, it may never happen at all. Now, as part of this, there's one more facet to telling your story that's critically important, and it's thinking about how you spend your time. Because as I mentioned today, Everybody is either busy or perceives themselves to be busy, right? But the truth is, many of us don't align the way we spend our time with the story we want to tell. And that's what separates the most successful people in the world from the rest of us, right? The most successful people in the world, the great equalizer is they have the same number of hours in the day as you and me. Everybody's got 24 hours. But when you think of the people you admire, whether they're in academics or athletics or government or civil rights or entertainment, regardless of where that person is in the world, they have 24 hours in the day. What makes them different is they first seek to maximize their discretionary time. They say, what can I get rid of? What can I stop doing so I have control over as many hours in the day as possible? And the second thing they say is, how do I then make the best use of that discretionary time? How do I make the best use of that discretionary time in a way that's aligned with my goals? Now, I say this with all due respect, and I say this because all of us need a break every now and then. But many of us and many of your students and many of your employees, they say they have a goal. They say they want to be known for these things. But when you look at how they spend their time, are they spending it in a way that's aligned with their goal, or are they spending hours a day scrolling through Facebook, or hours a day unproductively playing video games, or hours a day unproductively binge watching shows on Netflix? Again, there's nothing wrong with downtime. I'm a big believer in downtime. But in order to be successful, we have to rethink our relationship with time. And if we really want to tell a phenomenal story, we have to align our use of time with the story we want to tell. Now, one of the best opportunities, one of the reasons I say this is one of the best opportunities in 2018, an opportunity that goes back to what I said about 1993. In 1993, we had an almost invisible opportunity to tell our story. It almost didn't exist. In 2018, there is ample opportunity to tell your story. You could tell whatever story you want from just about anywhere at just about any time. So in order to give your story depth, one of the things that's available to us in 2018 is the opportunity to create more content. If you want to be known as great in your industry, if you want to be known as having knowledge, the single best way to do that in 2018 is to give that knowledge away for free. To start a blog, to start a video channel where you're telling people what you know, you're showing them what you know, you're helping people solve problems. You're anticipating the things people want to know and willingly sharing that information. That's when you build a reputation. That's when you build a personal brand. But it takes time. The reason most people don't do it, in fact, is because it takes time. But one of the best uses of your time is that content creation in a way that helps people solve problems. That's one of the best ways to accelerate your story. All right, the last thing I want to talk about before I get to your questions is the role of social media. So certainly content creation is part of it. Content creation through blogging, through video content. But I want to suggest for many of us, there's a tool that we're underutilizing that is designed exclusively to help us tell our stories as professionals, as we seek to build a career, that most of us underutilize. And it's the tool that was created by Reid Hoffman in 2003. And that tool, of course, is LinkedIn. Most of us don't spend enough time on LinkedIn as compared to the time we spend on Facebook or as the time we spend on unproductive stuff. Now, please understand, I don't say this because I work for LinkedIn. I do not work for LinkedIn. I don't own LinkedIn stock. I don't own so much as a LinkedIn t-shirt. Quite honestly, I have no skin in the game. If you never use LinkedIn, there is nothing bad that's going to happen to me. If you come out of this webinar and you use LinkedIn in a way that's very expert, it doesn't benefit me at all. But I strongly believe that of all the tools available to professionals in 2018, the one with the most potential upside for the largest percentage of professionals is LinkedIn. Now, but using LinkedIn isn't enough. out of today's session, my hope is that if you do see some value in telling your story on LinkedIn, even if you do nothing with blogging and you do nothing with video content, because that takes more time, I think most of us can do this, but I don't think you should do what the average LinkedIn user does. I think you should spend your time very differently than most LinkedIn users do. Because one of the problems is most people's use of LinkedIn is building a profile, making some connections, and then waiting back and hoping good things will happen. That doesn't work. What does work on LinkedIn is taking a few actions that can really set you apart when you're looking to tell your story. One that's critical is to make your LinkedIn profile and really everything you do on LinkedIn about the future, not the past. Many of us have been taught to use LinkedIn in the same way we have been taught to use resumes, where it's simply a laundry list of everything we've done throughout our career. You list it chronologically, and you kind of let the audience sort out what's relevant. I want you to throw that idea out the window. LinkedIn profiles should be a case for what you're capable of doing today and tomorrow. I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. I'll give you a couple of examples. When I was in college back in the late 80s, early 90s, 1990s, I bartended to help pay for my college education. It was a great job. I enjoyed it. It was the perfect complement to being a college student. But it's not what I want to do in 2018. So you will not see on my LinkedIn profile that I was once a bartender. Pretty simple example, right? But how many people do you see sharing job information? How many college students do you see emphasizing job information that's unrelated to what they want to be known for and known as? Now, you may say, okay, but maybe that's the only job opportunities that they've had throughout their college career. Yeah, but what about when they get into internships, and what about when they get into volunteer opportunities that are reflective of what they want to do? Shouldn't they emphasize that and not treat everything as equal? My strong advice is yes, that de-emphasize at minimum the stuff that isn't relevant or eliminate it altogether and start working towards building a story that's aligned with where you want to go. It's easier to do when you're more senior in your career, when you have more content to work with, but people are going to go where you take them. So if you talk only about what you've done in the past, that's not going to serve you as well as talking about how what you've done in the past prepares you for a certain type of work in the future. One of the biggest differentiators, the next thing I'd encourage you to do, encourage you to share with those you serve, is requesting recommendations on LinkedIn. I'm not talking about endorsements. Endorsements are simply where people validate that you have a given skill. Recommendations are a short written narrative where people talk about what you do well, where they write a paragraph emphasizing, publicizing what makes you great. The reason that's so critically important is, number one, recommendations are comparably rare on LinkedIn. So 2 or 3 on a profile are going to set that person way apart from his peers who have no recommendations. The other reason why they're so important is that it is someone else telling your story instead of you telling people why you're great. Much more credible and available at no cost. Now, the key with recommendations is you probably have to request them, but they are well worth requesting. Third thing I'd encourage you to do, and this goes back to the first bullet point, is to add detail about your most relevant experience, to de-emphasize the stuff that's not as relevant to your goal, to the story you want to tell, and add detail about the things that are relevant. This is pretty simple, but it's often missed because people treat LinkedIn as a resume. It's not a resume. It's a story about what you're capable of. So add detail about the most relevant experience. One of the biggest missing pieces, probably the biggest missing piece from most people's use of LinkedIn, is status updates. As I mentioned, most people, they tell their story through their profile on LinkedIn, and that's a good start, but I want to suggest that it's only a start. Let me detail what I'm talking about here. The profile on LinkedIn is just one way to tell your story, and for my money, it's not even the best way. Status updates are better. Now, when I'm talking about status updates, I'm talking about the opportunity that exists for us to share content, sometimes paired with a photo, sometimes paired with a link, sometimes paired with a video on LinkedIn. Short soundbite content that then, when you share it, goes into your connections newsfeed on LinkedIn. This is the biggest differentiator on the platform, and here's why. If you're only telling your story through your profile on LinkedIn, if you're not using status updates and you're using the profile as the only means by which you tell your story, I want you to think about all the things that have to happen in order for someone to receive that story, to hear that story. The first thing that has to happen, if you're not using status updates, you're only using your profile, the first thing that would have to happen is you would have to spontaneously pop into the head of that person, that out of nowhere they would have to think of you. And I don't know about you, but with all the other stuff I have to carry around in my head in 2018, not a lot of opportunity for that kind of serendipity. So, but let's say it does happen. Let's say that you pop into someone's head. The next thing they would have to do is they would have to search for you on LinkedIn. They would have to type your name into the search bar. Now, that sounds like an incidental thing, but LinkedIn is only as good as the information that it's given. Imagine for a moment that your name is Ailish Wasserman. Ailish, I don't know how often people get your name right on the first try, either pronouncing it or spelling it. I know I didn't. And if asked to do it right now, I might fail again. It's a great name, but it's not one that's easy to spell or easy for people to pronounce when they see it. So are they going to be able to seek you out on LinkedIn and find you through that search bar? Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. And you may think you're blessed if your name is John Smith or Jim Brown or something more common. Well, the problem there, of course, is when people seek out that name, they might find hundreds or thousands of results of which you are only one. So there's problems that happen when people go to seek out LinkedIn users. And then finally, they would have to digest all the information in your profile and come out of it with some sense of what your story is all about. My point is this: why rely on that alone when the status update solves all of those problems? Because when you post a status update on LinkedIn and it goes in the news feed, you don't have to spontaneously pop into people's heads. Whether or not they want to think about you, there you are in the news feed. It's like a billboard on the highway. You can't avoid it. Because of that, they don't have to spontaneously think of you. They don't have to seek you out. And you're giving them your story a soundbite at a time. You're showing them what your work is like instead of just telling them. And that's much more impactful. So if you do nothing else with LinkedIn out of today's session, I want you to start sharing status updates. Once a day is plenty. Once a week isn't bad, but I would suggest once a day is the right cadence. Whatever it is that is the most compelling thing you have to share about your work every day, that's where you get traction on LinkedIn. Now, a couple other things that can really set you apart on LinkedIn. One is using advanced search to make new connections. Now, I'm going to demo this if you've never used it. I want to emphasize that this is a free tool. Yes, you can go deeper with search with paid LinkedIn, but I don't want you to have paid LinkedIn. I want you to get by with the free version. So here's what advanced search does. If I hover over the search bar in LinkedIn, this little magnifying glass is going to come up on the right-hand side. When I click on that, I get a menu that looks like this. What I want you to do from here is I want you to go to All Filters. When you click on All Filters, you're going to see a menu that looks like this. And I'm going to do an example of a search. And I'm going to do first one that's really simple, and then I'm going to show you the power of LinkedIn by doing one that's a little more complex. So in this case, what I'm saying to LinkedIn is I want you to search your database of 500 million users worldwide, and I want you to narrow it based on location, those who are in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and I want to focus on people who are in human resources. And in this case, I'm going to say I want to focus on my first-degree connection. And let me explain this very briefly. If Ryan and I are connected on LinkedIn, he is a first-degree connection to me, and I am a first-degree connection to him. But if he is connected to someone else that I'm not connected to, that person then is a second-degree connection for me on LinkedIn. So in this case, I'm searching first-degree connections. What I'm saying to LinkedIn is tell me, who do I know, who am I connected with, who works in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in human resources. Now, if I were to do this search, and keep in mind everybody's results would differ because your network is different than mine, I would get 43 results. Melissa, Michelle, Marianne, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's pretty good because it can help me understand who does what within my network. But here is where the true power of LinkedIn comes in. This is where the genius of LinkedIn comes in. Let's say I do the same search, but I tell LinkedIn in this case, I don't want to focus on my first-degree connections. I want to know who is a second-degree connection, who is connected to the same people I am, but I am not connected to. In this case, LinkedIn is going to give me, notably, 521 results. So you start to see the power of these interconnections. Now, this is also a little bit of a challenge because I don't know these people. This information isn't immediately actionable. If I were to reach out to one of these individuals, it's kind of like making a cold call, and I might not get much of a response. But here's the genius of LinkedIn. LinkedIn is not only going to tell me who these people are, it's going to tell me how many connections I have in common with them, and moreover, it's going to tell me who those people are. So Melissa, Tanya, Heath, Steve, Jason, these are folks who are connected to, in this example, connected to Cody, who I don't know, but maybe I do want to know. Maybe I'm looking for a job, in this case at Fort Wayne Community Schools. Might it be a good connection for me to get an introduction to a human resources recruiter? Yes. Who can do that? All of these people with whom I'm connected. If I reach out to these individuals and I ask them for an introduction to this person, to Cody, isn't that going to be much more likely to end in a positive result than if I try to do it myself? LinkedIn gives you that opportunity for free through advanced search. So yes, use advanced search. One last thing, this is a little bit incidental, but I'd encourage you to do it nonetheless, is to send personalized connection requests and personalized responses. This is kind of baked into the desktop version of LinkedIn. If I click on connect on someone's profile that I'm not yet connected with, LinkedIn is going to prompt me to add a personal note. And I highly encourage that you do that when you have any need to sell the connection, to explain to people why you want to connect. But it's not as well known that you can do this on the mobile app as well. If you click on the More menu on someone's profile, there's the opportunity to personalize the invite. If you don't do this, people are just going to get the generic LinkedIn template invite, which really doesn't say anything. This is an opportunity to say a few sentences. Say, hey, Jim, it was great to meet you at the job fair. Or, Jim, I'm looking to learn more about your company. Again, useful to you, hopefully useful to your students and those you serve at large. When I talk about responding to connection requests in a personalized way, I want to share what I mean by that. Let's say you get a connection request from someone you don't know well, but who's still a good connection for you. Many people just make that connection and that's the end of the story. I don't want you to do that. I want you to take one more step. And you can use a template for this. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time it happens. But if you get a connection request from someone you don't know well, I want you to have a template that says, hey, thanks for the request. By the way, here's the problem I solve, or the problems I solve, and if appropriate, for whom. If that's of interest to you, let's talk. Otherwise, have a great night. It's just a way of helping understand what that person's interest is. And I'll tell you, 9 times out of 10, I don't get a response when I do this, but the 1 time out of 10 when I do makes it worthwhile because that person is connecting with me with intent for a reason. This helps me understand what that intent is. All right, so let's come to a close here. Let's talk about a few final important things, bring everything together. What I want you to do with social media is, where appropriate, to connect with your students and your employers. LinkedIn is a safe place to do that. I don't necessarily recommend connecting with all your coworkers or certainly all your students on Facebook or other platforms, but LinkedIn is a safe place to do it. I would also encourage you, if nothing else, to model best practices. Your students, your junior employees, they're going to learn from what you do more than what you say. So if you can model best practices in social media, in networking, in personal branding, those things are going to stick with them. And I think it's also important that we understand the distinction between those of us who are more veteran and those who are just starting career paths. One of the first things to understand is that their use of social media up until they begin thinking about career paths is going to likely be almost entirely social, and that's more perilous because they're sharing things that are more controversial, quite honestly, than anything I might share on LinkedIn. So we have to understand that and help them understand how they need to shift their personal brand when they're seeking to build careers and not just use social media for their social lives. Second thing that I'd encourage you to think about and encourage them to think about is they might want to be a little more expansive in building a network. At the age of 49, having been now 25 years into my career, there's a lot of degree to which my time is best spent with the people I already know, reinvesting in those relationships. Your younger connections might not have that advantage. They may need to spend a lot of time building a network and taking chances on connecting with people who may or may not be relevant to them, or they may not be relevant to, but they need to be more expansive as they build a network. And this one's really important, maybe one of the most important things I'm going to say all afternoon. What really matters is what you do in the real world. Your use of social media becomes a lot more meaningful when you have things of value to talk about. Creating content, yes, but also making a difference in the world. If you're making a difference in the world, if you're doing great stuff, you're going to have no shortage of things to talk about on LinkedIn or on social media in general, but it's really hard to create something out of nothing. What really matters at the end of the day is that eventually they log off of social media, they go, they meet people face to face, and they make a difference in the world. Now, I also want to leave you with some homework. Here's the great news. You don't have to do it, and I probably will never know even if you do, but I wanted to leave you with some action items out of today's session. First thing I'd encourage you to do is to answer the questions that I put forward as integral to helping you build your story, to practice on yourself. And ideally, you've already done that, but if you haven't, just start to think about those answers. Absolutely think about time. It's the only thing we have. Think about how you spend your time and consider if you do have the opportunity to get rid of some things that are less productive, how can you start telling your story through the creation of substantive content? How are you going to enhance your network? It all comes back to relationships. Are you connected to the people who can move you forward, the people you can move forward? If not, make some new connections. And then if it's helpful, I encourage you to take what I've shared with you here today to your students, to your employees, to the people you serve. Certainly, I would love to help you with that, but if nothing else, my goal today is to give you information that's of value to those you serve so that you can be more relevant to them. One last thing I want to leave you with is this. It's the point that I began with. Today, your story defines the opportunities available to you. Your destiny is going to be controlled by what people say when you are not in the room. What you make of those opportunities defines your legacy. If you've gotten into the career development field or you've gotten into human resources, I know you want to leave a legacy. So much of that is determined by the stories you tell and the relationships you build. My hope today is that I've helped you in ways that are going to allow you to tell a better story and make better connections. With that, I want to say thank you very much for your time and attention. And now, Elish, I think that we're ready for any questions that people have.
It appears we don't have any questions in the chat box. If anyone has some questions, though, feel free to type them in, or, of course, you can contact Anthony directly. And we appreciate your time and being part of this webinar today. Thank you, Anthony.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure working with you and speaking with all of you this afternoon.
We'll give everybody a few more minutes here to see if there are any questions. A reminder to put them in the chat window if you have them. All right. I think you're going to get out of here with no questions, Anthony.
Well, certainly, as Elish mentioned, I welcome those questions by email. Even a phone call is perfectly welcome. If you ask me something I already know, I'm going to get a nice little endorphin rush and feel like I know something. If you ask me something I don't know, I'll research it and learn something new. So any questions are welcome.
Awesome. Well, thank you all again for your time today. Big thank you to Anthony and Elish from MWASE. We will be sending out a recording of the webinar to everyone who attended today. Should be in your inbox within a week or so. Don't forget to sign up for our next Regional ACE webinar when it becomes available in early 2019. And if you're going to be at MPACE next week, stop by and say hi to us. Thanks again.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Elish. Thanks, everybody.